Before the tale begins, if you like slow-burning Western stories about people who find home in the cold, stay with this one. Subscribe and hit like to catch more. The wagon's wheel thudded like a far-off heart beneath the weight of snow. Nora Briggs held the reins with hands that had grown hard as iron from winter work and worry. Her coat was a patched thing of wool and leather, cinched tight under her chin. Beside her, Caleb slept in fits, small fists pressed to his mouth, breath fogging the canvas. The plains had folded themselves into a white thing that swallowed tracks, and the sky had shut its mouth around them. Wind moved across the land in great hungry seams that ground at the wagon's boards. At times, the horse dipped its head and they slid, leaving the faint, desperate gouge of a track that the next gust would scrub clean. They had no place to go that night. The town beyond the creek, if the creek could be called town, was a smudge of 2 chimneys and a lean-to, 20 miles and a river between them and safety. Nora had thought for hours of turning back toward the river, of sitting tight where they were until spring, but the creak of the axle and the horse's labored breath made retreat untenable. Caleb would not last another night of wind without a stove. He was thin enough to doubt the bone itself could hold shape under the cold. A low swell of land rose ahead, a folded ridge called Dust Creek Hill where the Bridger house had once kept vigil. She knew the place by sight alone, by the way the trees cut the wind into lessening, by the chimney's shadow that jutted like a broken tooth when the sun managed to show its face. For years, the Bridgers had raised their voice against storms, and the house had stood with boards warped and porch sagging like a slumped shoulder. The Bridgers were gone from talk. Nora had only seen the place in winter when the world drew its breath tight and turned away. When the first shape of it grew clear through the drift, relief came like a warm hand. The wagon's iron sang underfoot as the horse strained and bumped up the last rise. Snow kicked higher, but the house stood, squat and stubborn against the white. Its windows were black, shutters swinging freestanding on one hinge. A strip of the porch rail had splintered away. The door hung crooked and raw at its threshold. Smoke did not rise from the chimney. Everything about it said vacant, but vacancy could shelter. Nora drove the wagon up to the porch and steadied the horse. She wrapped Caleb in the spare blanket and half carried, half dragged him across boards that threw back cold through the soles of her boots. The door gave under her shoulder with a whining groan like a tired man. Inside, the room smelled of old wood and the faint, sweet rot of long-closed places. Snow lay packed against the kitchen door like a sleeping thing. The stove sat in the middle of the room like a black heart, its iron belly caped with old ash, its pipe choked with soot. Everything about it said vacant, but vacancy could shelter. Nora drove the wagon up to the porch and steadied the horse. She wrapped Caleb in the spare blanket and half carried, half dragged him across boards that threw back cold through the soles of her boots. The door gave under her shoulder with a whining groan like a tired man. Inside, the room smelled of old wood and the faint, sweet rot of long-closed places. Snow lay packed against the kitchen door like a sleeping thing. The stove sat in the middle of the room like a black heart, its iron belly caked with old ash, its pipe choked with soot. Light came in from a crack where a board had given, thin and desperate as a candle wick. Nora moved without pause. She had a small, flat tin for matches sewn into her pocket, her father's, dented where a hammer had met it more than once. She spread on the table the oilskin bundle that had been the sum of their belongings, a shirt for Caleb, a bread knife with a bone handle, a jar of pickled turnips. She fed slivers of dry wood from the wagon's emergency stash, twigs she'd told herself they'd need, into the iron mouth and struck one match. The match hissed out like a bitten candle. She struck another. The third caught, small and insistent, and for a moment the flame was a thing of private fellowship, steady against the rush of cold. The tinder took, and then the old ash gave with a sigh that sounded like a window opening. Fire is a blunt kind of prayer. It does not ask for miracles so much as it makes room for them. The stove took, at first thin and coughing, and then purred like something waking. Its body warmed in a way that felt almost personal. The iron softened its voice. Nora fed it carefully, coaxing rather than forcing, a child's patience in the face of illness. Caleb blinked awake to the smoke of warmth and lay beside the stove like a bird finding a sheltered nook. For the first time in days, the child's fingers lost the white of near death and took on color. He pressed his face to the heat and inhaled as if learning breath anew. They slept in shifts then, Nora keeping one eye on the door as the stove's small flame made tracks of comfort across the floorboards. Snow tapped at the house like knuckles on a coffin lid, but inside the iron sang, and the kettle put out a thin, hopeful steam. In the morning, when the wind eased enough for light to come without slam, Nora opened a chest tucked under the upstairs eaves. It had been left by someone who had intended to stay and could not. Inside were fragments: a child's wooden horse with one ear gone, a scatter of letters wrapped in oilcloth, a small envelope sealed with wax the color of dried blood. She found the letters later, after Elias Crow came. Elias arrived on a horse that looked like he'd borrowed it from winter itself, lean, with a coat the color of river mud. The mail rider appeared the way some weather arrives, as if he'd been moving in the open and the house simply stepped out into his path. He was a man of narrow smiles and hands that still smelled of leather. He carried a satchel across his shoulder that had the enduring shape of all a mail rider's reserves: letters, a few shillings in copper, and the habit of conversation. His face had a sunburn that would not be soothed by towns. His eyes had that steady thing that had watched the country too long to believe in much without reason. He found them when he rode the ridge. He slowed at the porch, scanning with a rider's quick distrust. "House taken?" he asked before he tethered his horse, as if asking about ownership had the power to change scaled weather. "No," Nora said, her voice like the scratch of coal. She stepped aside to let him look in. "Found it last night. Stove was cold as a grave. We got it lit." Elias dismounted with the caution of one who knows how easy it is to step into trouble. He moved with small, exact gestures, the kind that come from long afternoons of saddle and sky. He lifted the stove's lid, ran a knuckled thumb along the seam, and then nodded at the smoke line on the pipe. "Chimneys held," he observed, which was as much as to say the house might cough and live. He produced from his sack a strip of cloth and a handful of nails and offered them as if handing over the world. "Rode by with supplies for the post," he said. "Figured I might find someone. You're not from out this way, are you?" "From farther," Nora answered. "I had a homestead before, but—" She did not finish. The wind had already given her the art of stopping sentences where shame might take root. "Name's Nora. This is Caleb." "Name's Elias Crow," he said simply. He sat on the porch and unwrapped for them a loaf of bread and a small wedge of cheese, enough to fill the room with late summer smells that seemed nearly treasonous in winter. His hands were quick with a soup pot and a ladle. He knelt and held the heat of the bowl to Caleb, and the boy ate as if given new currency. Elias had been the one to judge when a thing could be left. A mail rider knew people by their small requests and the way they rode home. He told Nora then, as they warmed themselves and the kettle was coaxed to sing, that the Bridgers had not simply gone away. Samuel Bridger had taken ill 2 winters ago. The stories he carried back said fever and weak breath, and then silence. His wife, Clara, who had arrived once, like many others, with letters folded from a name far off, had kept the house a while after. Then there had been none who could keep it. "No kin left to mind it," Elias said. "Folk reckon it's just a house to take if you need it." His voice carried the small, practical ethics of a roadman. A house is shelter, and shelter can be given when it's empty. When he spoke of Clara, Nora listened as if the name were a bell. The mail rider hesitated, then produced a small scrap he had in his bag. A ledger note from the post indicating a forwarding address that had never answered. "She wrote," he said.
She wrote to the company twice, sent stamps from Boston. They said she'd married Bridger and that she'd be kept warm. She signed things with steady hands. Folks called her a mail-order bride once. Elias's voice dropped into a respectful tone, not mockery. There was the hint of something like reverence in the way frontier folk used the term for those women who came across long papers to tether their lives to men they'd barely met. They said she had grit. Nora did not think in terms of labels.
To her, Clara's name meant a person who'd slept on these floors, who had cut her hands on the same boards. She thought of the waxed envelope upstairs and the way her fingers had brushed brittle twine. It seemed a small miracle that Elias had come at the exact time when their need matched his supplies. The kettle steamed. Daylight in the room took on a color like bread crust. Elias stayed that afternoon and into the evening, hammering loose the shutter that hung by a single peg and driving a set of nails that made the porch less treacherous. He brought a coil of rope that had 1,000 uses in a country where everything had to hauled and held with patience. "I'll be by on the run again come week," he told Nora as he patted his saddle. "If you need letters run to the post, I can bring them. We'll keep the stove company, and keep the house from being taken by wolves, or worse, by men who'd make bargains out of other folks' misfortune." Grudgingly, Nora allowed the idea, the sheltering of her pride collapsing under the necessity of a warm night for Caleb. Elias's hands were practical and never asked the kind of questions that bleed men dry: why she was alone, how she had come to wander. They spoke of small things: where to find dry wood without breaking a neighbor's sense of property, how the well sometimes froze at night, and how the creek draft could be coaxed to thaw by a running bucket. And their talk was all the kind of frontier theology that mattered: trade, help, reciprocity. The first clear evening after the storm, when the gust slowed to a hush and the sky opened a little at the edges, Nora went back to the upstairs chest. She took the little bundle into the parlor and sat by the stove with the letters on her knee. The paper was rough, the ink browned by a climate of hands and time. The envelopes were addressed in a narrow hand, the kind that suggested a woman who wrote often and with intent. The wax seal bore a pressed emblem, an anchor crossed with a sprig, that had been warmed and sealed with the ceremony of someone who intended her words to outlast a life. She read aloud, because Caleb had curled into a tight ball and listened, and because even in the act of reading there is the hope that words will stitch warmth into a house the way a needle mends cloth. The letters, in sequence, told the furniture of a life: of Clara's arrival with a steamer trunk and a laugh that would not diminish, of her learning to cook on the iron stove, of the first winter she called a teacher, and the second when the fever took Samuel like a reckoning. They were small documents of domestic survival, lists of what to plant, a note about a neighbor who would watch the mare, the way she had carved the beam over the hearth with a steady hand because she liked the feel of a name worn into wood. Beneath the ordinary, they revealed something else: Clara's fierce pride in having chosen a place not just for herself, but for anyone who might need shelter. She read aloud because Caleb had curled into a tight ball and listened, and because even in the act of reading there is the hope that words will stitch warmth into a house the way a needle mends cloth. The letters, in sequence, told the furniture of a life: of Clara's arrival with a steamer trunk and a laugh that would not diminish, of her learning to cook on the iron stove, of the first winter she called a teacher, and the second when the fever took Samuel like a reckoning. They were small documents of domestic survival, lists of what to plant, a note about a neighbor who would watch the mare, the way she had carved the beam over the hearth with a steady hand because she liked the feel of a name worn into wood. Beneath the ordinary, they revealed something else: Clara's fierce pride in having chosen a place not just for herself, but for anyone who might need shelter. There was a line, sharp and private, that read like a promise. "If I should go before my time," one letter said, "I leave this house, to keep the hearth for those who walk with empty hands. I am not wealthy, but I can make sure the house remembers." Nora's fingers found the last envelope. It was smaller, heavier than the others. Where the other seals had the anchor she had used in lighter script,
This one bore an extra loop in the seal and had been stamped twice. Something inside the envelope made the paper shiver when she tipped it open. A folded sheet, and behind it a small, flat paper the color of bone. A note had been written in the same narrow hand, a few lines, folded and then sealed again with wax. Nora felt suddenly as if she were the last in a line of listeners. She imagined Clara, alone at a table, the window cut with frost, sealing words with a small flame as if to preserve a last defense. Caleb noticed the weight of the letter in her hand, as if it were a thing alive. "Mama," he whispered, his voice a soft thing like darning thread. He sat up and watched the lamp flame make a halo over Nora's head. "Read it, please." Nora slid the wax with a fingernail. The crack of the seal was like the opening of a small truth. Inside came a line that sat on the page like a stone thrown into still water. It was not an accusation. It was not a demand for vengeance in some loud sense. It was a plan, written with the certainty of someone who knew how to make law out of love. The note said, simply, that Clara had taken the effort to ensure the house stayed a refuge. She had written to a broker in the East, arranged for a deed to be kept safe with instructions should the Bridger name die out. She had warned that men might think the place abandoned and come take it for gain. She had asked, in measured words, that if anyone found the letters and could prove stewardship and hospitality, they should be allowed to claim the house. The language was plain and legal and also warm. The house should not be a commodity but a harbor. It read also, in a part of the fragile paper that seemed more a whisper than a signature, of a grievance. Clara wrote of a man, Samuel's cousin according to an earlier scrap, who had hopes for the land that were not honest. She spoke of the hard men who used the law to dress up greed with paper. She wrote that if the house could ever be put to better use, if someone came who would keep it for those who needed it rather than sell it for profit, then it was hers to give away, and in giving she would have her revenge, not blood or public shame, but the nullifying of covetous plans by making the house a place that refused to be used for gain. Nora sat with the letter folded in her palm, the heat from the stove making the wax soft. The idea of a woman's pen being the instrument of frontier justice struck her as odd and delicate and right. Revenge without cruelty. Justice as a careful bequest. Clara's plan had the sharpness of a winter that learned how to survive. It was revenge practiced as preservation. It was, in its way, a kind of law. "She meant for this," Elias said quietly from the doorway. He had come back, as he had promised, and found them poring over the paper. Meant for someone who'd keep the house open. His face suggested that he understood the small gravity of such a thing. He had seen deeds and contracts and the ways men could scribble greed into the margins. The mail rider's world moved on paper and horses. He had delivered births and death notices and small reconciliations. He sat and listened to Nora read the lines aloud, and the words made a map of intent where once there had been only abandonment. Nora thought then of the way she had been running, of nights where she had set off with only the cold between herself and the next place, of the way fear had taught her a habit of movement. She thought of Caleb, who had been born to a world that kept no promises beyond the moment. The letter was a promise. It was a debt of hospitality that might yet be paid. The idea of keeping the house, of making a place where wanderers might rest, settled on her like a garment. "Maybe that's what the house wants," Caleb murmured, as if repeating a story. "Maybe it remembers, like Clara said." Nora pressed the paper to her chest and let the stove's heat wash over her. She did not know what it meant to make law in the name of mercy, but she knew how little a child needed to be kept from a wind's teeth that night. The letters became a kind of instruction and a command. Repair the stove, mend the roof, open the door to travelers, keep the deed safe if you can find it. The waxed note was a key, and the key hung, for now, in Nora's hands. Outside, the wind turned and sighed, as if taking news to neighbors. Inside, the stove beeped and settled into a steady glow. Elias read the letters more slowly, like a man tasting a new country. He put his hat on the floor beside him, and, for the first time since they'd met, Nora allowed the idea of staying to drift like a warm smell through her thoughts. It was not the rashness she had always fled. It was a plan of keeping. When Elias prepared to leave, he did not go empty-handed. He had a scrap of paper sewn into his coat that was a healer's list and a small tin of salve. "I'll bring you whatever I can on the runs," he promised, "and I'll ask about that deed. If there is a deed, I'll find it. Folks keep records in strange places." He paused by the door and looked back at the stove. A house with fire can be a dangerous thing to the imagination of men with empty hands. "Mind who you trust, but mind also who you don't," he said, finishing with the blunt counsel of a man who'd watched too many promises turn to ash. After he left, Nora took the letters and read each one again. She found, tucked behind the last page, a scrap that might have been intended for the broker, a name and a place where letters had been sent. That, Elias had said, might be the trail to follow. Nora folded the letters into the oilcloth and tucked them into her father's match tin, which had become a reliquary of small holdings. She felt the heavy tick of responsibility, the gravity of the decision that had edged toward her the way drifts edge toward a porch. That evening, other figures moved down the road in the dim that followed a storm. A woman with a bundle, a traveler who later would be known to Nora as Mary Dean, whose wagon axle had broken not far from Dust Creek Hill, an old miner named Joe who had a smile like a collapsed moon and hands that could mend a roof quicker than any sermon could ask for mercy. They came because word of a lit chimney travels like prayer across winter plains. The Bridger house, which Clara had intended as shelter, became in the space of a week a place that answered to its name. When the first of them knocked, a timid tap that made the boards sing, Nora opened and found Mary Dean with her hair uncombed and cheeks split by wind. Nora saw in her the same tiredness she'd held in her own bones. She did not ask for papers or proof. She handed Mary a bowl of stew. The act was small and enormous all at once. Hospitality is not a grandness, it is the simplest arithmetic of giving bread to the hungry. By then, the stove had steadied into a voice that belonged to the house. It sputtered sometimes when the wind pressed its face to the windows, but mostly it held steady, shifting from breath to a steady hum. Smoke rose in a column from the chimney and cut a line across the pale sky. The house began to remember itself by noise and smell. The clink of a spoon against bowl, the soft scrape of a chair, the laughter of a child who had found a crack in the world that allowed him to be warm. On a morning where the snow looked as if someone had smoothed it with a broad hand, Elias returned with a letter he had found at the post, an old ledger notation finally noticed by a clerk who had the time to look, and with it came directions that might lead to the deed. Nora felt the paper like a rope looped around the days to come. The words in Clara's letter had been both an invitation and a seed of stubbornness. Keep this place open, and in keeping it, you will, in some measure, enact the rightful revenge of a woman whose instrument was her pen. Yet the word revenge hung in Nora's ears like something she had been taught not to say. The frontier had its own justice, a neighbor's hand when the roof fell, a horse pulled from mud at risk. Clara's revenge, as Nora took it in, was the undoing of avarice through the making of a community. It was not loud, it was patient. It had the patient cruelty of law harnessed to mercy. That night, Nora sat with Caleb asleep beside the stove, hands folded over the waxed note as if to keep the promise warm. She listened to the house settle, boards contracting, the stairs small size, and told herself in a low voice that the next step would be to find the deed, to find whoever might claim kinship, and to hold the line. She felt the weight of being custodian not only of shelter, but of a story that had crossed the sea to find its place on a hill. Outside, the plains were brittle with cold, and the snow glinted like a cache of small glass beads. Inside, the house had answers in its letters and in the steadiness of a stove that would not die. The Bridger house, which had waited for someone who would keep its hearth for the wandering, had found Nora as much as she had found it. When the knock came the next morning, it was not the polite tapping of a traveler. It was firmer, the kind of knock that pulls a man up from his bed to meet the day. 3 sharp raps that made the windows vibrate. Nora opened the door to find a figure she had not expected. A man in a long coat with the clean look of a town clerk, papers folded inside a satchel, eyes that measured property like a man counting coin. He carried with him the aura of formality and the edge of law. At his elbow was a younger man with the blank face of someone who had been sent to do another's thinking for them. Nora recognized in the way he coughed at the cold that he had not been long in the open. He had come from a place where rooms were heated all winter and men wore clean shirts. He had the confidence of one who had seen a blank deed and thought of the benefit. There are men in this country who see an abandoned house and do the arithmetic of ownership before they ask whether a child's belly will be filled. "Afternoon," the clerk said, and his voice slid across the porch with the politeness of a document. "I'm Mr. Harlan. I represent the interests of certain buyers who have an eye for land in this district. We noticed your chimney. I'm authorized to purchase property left unclaimed." He placed a hand on his satchel as if there might be a contract inside with his name already printed on the signature line. Nora felt a cold rise in her chest like a tide. The letters lay in her pocket, the note that promised a counterweight to men such as this. Elias, who had been following on the ridge with a bundle of coal, came up behind Harlan like a weathered thing that knew which way the wind would blow. He looked at Harlan with the slow distrust of one whose errands have taught him to be wary. "That's a house with people," Elias said, with a bluntness that read as loyalty over civility. Harlan smiled, as if service were merely a costume he could don. "I'm sure there are arrangements we can make," he said. "A good place like this might be put to better use. Development does not mean ruin, it means making tidy what is left to rot." Nora thought of Clara's words and the waxed seal, and a quiet anger settled in her like a settling hearth.
She opened her coat and took out the letters and held them like a talisman. The paper shook in her hand, not from cold, but from the tremor of something harder to explain. The recognition that the house which had sheltered her for a night had been willed to the idea of shelter itself. She set the letters on the table between them as if laying out the law. Elias did not let Harlan's smile stay. "There's more than one kind of record in this valley," he said. "Letters count in the way words count. People will remember who kept heat in a house when the fires were out." Harlan placed a hand to his chin and regarded Nora with a new interest, as if a business problem had become an intriguing puzzle. "Perhaps," he said, "but law is law. If you can prove a claim, if you have a deed or a line of succession, then we are speaking the same language." Nora set her jaw. She thought of the deed that might be hidden in some distant office, and of Elias's promise to find it. She thought of Clara's quiet vengeance, the making of a legal instruction that tied a house to the idea of hospitality. She folded the letters into the oilcloth and tucked them back into the tin, feeling them like a small engine under her breast. "You can wait," she told Harlan, and her voice had the subdued hardness of winter. "We're putting the house to use. We'll get what paper is needed, but we won't sell it to be turned into someone else's margin." Harlan's mouth tightened. He looked as if he had expected her to be more pliable. "You give us 2 weeks," he said, "and we'll look through the archives. If there's no deed, then, well, business proceeds." Elias shifted, and for a moment Nora saw the outline of a plan form in her mind. Not a plan of fists and retribution, but of patient work and paper, of letters read aloud by a stove, of neighbors who would vouch for those who sheltered them.
Clara's revenge was not a blow, but a brim. A woman who had thought ahead and had the modest cunning to leave instructions that outlived her. Nora folded the tin into her pocket and felt the weight of it like a new kind of coin. When Harlan left down the lane, his steps measured and his sack heavier with the taste of possible gain, Nora closed the door and felt the house draw a breath. The stove hummed and the kettle sighed. Caleb came looking for stew, hair messy and cheeks warmed by sleep, and took up a spoon as if to measure the world again by what it offered. Outside, the plains stood as they would always stand, indifferent and endless. But the house had taken a stance. In the small, careful language of letters and a wax seal, of a mail rider's oath and a widow's stubbornness, the Bridger house had been claimed by those who would keep its hearth for those who needed it. It had no lawyer in its bones, no city man in its rafters, only the slow, steady accumulation of people who knew how to help each other bury cold with warmth. Nora set the kettle on the stove and let steam fog the window. She fingered the match tin in her pocket and thought of the many small decisions that had brought her here. The choice to press on when the wagon complained, to drive up the ridge, to accept aid without giving up pride. She thought of Clara's careful revenge, how a woman's pen could serve justice across seas and years. For the first time since the wind had found them, she felt not flight, but a pulling toward a place that might be mended. There would be papers to find, records to coax from town clerks, and men like Harlan to be met with the steady patience Clara's note had taught her. There would be nights when the wind sharpened like a scythe, and days when wood rationed thin. But the house had a heart now, the stove that would not go cold, the letters that argued on behalf of the homeless, the outstretched hands of a mail rider who would not see the place fall to men with empty conscience. At dusk, as the lamps were set and a chorus of voices, Elias's humming at one stove, Mary Dean's laugh in another corner, rose like a small brittle hymn. Nora sat by the hearth and read the letters once more. In a folded corner she found a last small thing. The name Clara Bridger carved into a beam, worn smooth by years. She ran her hand over the groove and felt, under her palm, the memory of knives and nails, of hands that had made a home and willed it to others. Caleb fell asleep beside her lap, the steady rise and fall of his chest an argument against ruin. Nora closed her eyes for a second and made a kind of vow to herself, a vow not to let the house become a tally, but to make it what Clara had meant, shelter for people whose footsteps went thin on the road. If there was to be revenge, it would be in the refusal to let greed turn a hearth into profit, in the stubbornness of a turned roof that would shelter the poor and put a stop to those who wished to turn every refuge into ledger. When she woke in the night, she heard the soft, certain sound of a knock at the door. It was not the tone of a clerk or a would-be buyer. It was a small, earnest tap that meant a person on foot, needing warmth. She moved to the door and unlatched it, to find a young woman with frost in her eyelashes and a baby wrapped close to her chest. The woman looked like a thing that had walked the long miles between settlements on a faith only hunger could teach. Her eyes went to the stove as if checking a heartbeat. "Please," she said, not asking as much of a choice as of a fact, "we've nowhere else." Nora stepped aside. The house, as if learning its own MAME, opened without asking for scripture or coin. The stove smoke rose into the sky like a flag made of answer. Outside, the ridge swallowed footprints, and the snow waited. Inside, the Bridger house filled with breath and speech and the clatter of spoons. The first steps of a community had been small and ordinary. A shared loaf, a mended roof, a baby warmed against the iron. But each step made the house less an abandoned structure and more a place that carried memory forward. On the table, under the lamp, the waxed note lay folded but not forgotten. It had done what a small, steadfast thing could do, set a course. Nora had a plan now that would not be measured in coin, but in the shelter offered to the next soul who came knocking. The road to the clerk's office would be long, and Harlan would press his case with the grammar of profit. But Nora had something more substantial than stubbornness. She had a love letter to a house, a mail writer to champion the letters, and a list of names of those who could vouch that the Bridger house had saved them. The small law of community is often the only law that matters on a hill. Later that week, after men came with hands to mend the roof and women brought bread and soup, Elias sat by the stove with Nora and spoke in a low voice about towns and papers. "If there is a deed," he said, "we'll find it. If not, we've already done the most important thing. We've made a line of witnesses. People will remember this house as more than a piece of land. They will remember the nights we kept one another warm." Nora looked into the stove and saw the flare of a coal like a small red eye. She felt the heat like an answer. The idea of revenge, Clara's quiet, patient revenge, grew in her mind into a broader shape. It was, after all, frontier justice of the most stubborn kind. That which binds people to one another so tightly greed cannot tear them apart. And though there were papers to find and men to outmaneuver, the house would not stand by while the world turned its ledger pages. In the wan light, as neighbors filed in for stew and the baby cooed under Nora's hand, the Bridger house learned to be a refuge. The letters lay on the table, a small archive of faith and care. Nora hitched her breath to a new kind of hope. The next day, she would walk into town with Elias by her side, and the letters tucked safely in her coat. And she would ask for the deed the same way she had asked for the stove to be lit, one cautious strike at a time, until the flame took. Until then, the stove would keep its vigil, the chimney would send its steady signal to Dust Creek and beyond, and the house would practice the slow, deliberate revenge Clara had crafted, turning a claim of ownership into a claim of shelter, a deed of profit into a covenant of care. At dawn, someone would come with news from the records. For now, the Bridger house warmed itself on slow human kindness and the letters that had crossed an ocean to lay a plan in the hands of a widow and her son. The house listened and remembered, and the plains beyond it, which had been a hard and indifferent place, began, by the work of a few, to look smaller and softer around the edges. Outside, snow drifted in a last whisper. Inside, the stove clicked and the kettle sang. Nora tucked the waxed note into her pocket and reached for a match, striking it with the practiced thumb of a woman who had already answered the first test. The flame caught, small and obedient, and the house brightened around them like a heart that had learned, finally, to beat steady.